Hi, everyone. My name's Carol Pedersen. Welcome to the Saxton Meet the Author series, where we talk to speakers about their books and the books they've written, the books they like to read, and their purpose and meaning behind their strategies and why they created the book. My guest today is Rosie Yeo, and we are going to be discussing her book called Go for Bold: How to Create Powerful Strategy in Uncertain Times. Hi, Rosie.
Hello, how you going, Carol?
I'm well. How are you?
Very well, thank you. I'm just making sure my webcam's all right.
Yeah, you look great.
Fantastic. Thank you.
So I am so excited to talk about your book.
Thank you.
When I first got it, however many weeks ago you sent it to me, I looked at the cover and I was like, really? How am I going to build a strategy right now when I'm just trying to survive? And now I've read it and I was like, this whole book is full of hope. And
I'm glad you
everyone,
say that.
no, it's true. And everyone should be reading it. Like not just leaders, not just CEOs, but the entire, your entire team should read this book. So thank you for that. I couldn't wait to get that out. Could you tell?
Oh, thank you so much.
But
I really appreciate it.
it's true. Anyway, what I always like to start with is talk to me and our listeners about why you wrote this book. What inspired you? What were you thinking when you started to create the book?
So I've worked as a strategist for a number of years, and most of the time when I'm working with organizations, whether they're big or small, we always start with the time frame. What do you want to do in 3 years? What do you want to do in 5 years? Sometimes it can be 20 years ahead. But over the past 2 years throughout the pandemic, more and more I've had clients coming to me saying, like Rosie, we just need to survive the next 6 or 12 months. We just need to worry about the future later. And while that absolutely makes sense in the midst of a crisis, we can't stay fixed in our mindset forever. So I started thinking about, how do I help people rebuild their confidence to start looking at their longer game? And more importantly than ever, how do we take that ability to adapt and that we've proven ourselves to be so creative at responding to short-term crises. How do we take that new confidence and creativity and now start applying it to our longer-term plans, just looking that bit further ahead?
Right. And that's where I think I connected with the fact that I think a lot of people should be reading the book. When you talk about, if you could elaborate on creating the right environment and the right culture for people to feel inspired but I guess safe. Can you talk a bit about that?
Yeah. Creating strategy, our first port of call is to start thinking about, what's the deck we need to put together? What's all the data we need? How can we get all the information together and thrash this out? But information is really important and analysis is really important. But when we're talking strategy, we're creating a future that doesn't yet exist. So we actually need to apply imagination and creativity to that as well, to blend both imagination and information. And that only happens when you give people that creative space and time. You've almost got to step back and say, let's give ourselves some breathing space. Let's build some trust in the room and some comfort to try new things, to suggest new ideas. That I often tell people, if you're doing your strategy meeting the exact same way that you run every other meeting in your organization, how are the ideas that come out of the strategy session going to be any different from all the other meetings you've had leading up to the strategy session? So it does take that time and space.
Exactly. And if you could elaborate a little bit more for business leaders on how we sabotage that creativity and imagination and what we can do to avoid that.
So one of the worst things we do, and we're all guilty of it, I think, I know I've been guilty of it in the future, is you walk into a room, particularly if you're going into a boardroom or a senior executive group, and you walk into a room kind of really keen to contribute and to prove that you're worth being in that room so that you have value and information to add. And that's great. That's why you've been invited to the meeting. But if you're only focused on what you already know, you miss the opportunity to learn and view things from different perspectives. So I often encourage people, don't walk into a room wanting to introduce yourself, telling everybody what you know about. Walk into a room thinking about, what don't I know? What am I curious about? What might I hear interesting things about from other people sitting around the table? And all of a sudden, you've got this start of a more interesting conversation because it starts at its core with curiosity.
Really hard to do, though, for people that are high achieving and high performers. They feel like they've got to come to these situations knowing it all. That was one of the things that really leapt off the page for me when I thought, how do we encourage people to be curious and be confident about being curious?
I think a lot of it comes down to the way you set up the meeting. Again, with a lot of meetings, we walk into the meeting and people give you an agenda to start with, and the agenda just has headings. These are the things. So everybody's you're almost looking at the agenda going, yep, item 1, that's a yes. Item 2, that's a no. Item 3, that's a list of 3, or whatever it might be. I often encourage people to start thinking about their strategy meeting more with a series of questions that we need to answer. Because if you're starting the conversation again with a question that you need to answer or something you don't know, you're giving people permission to wonder out loud. And I often say that, one of the most powerful phrases you can start a conversation with is what if, or imagine. And all of a sudden you give people permission to not focus on what they know, but to ask questions about what they're not quite sure about. And that's where we come up with new ideas. Because at the end of the day, big, brave strategy needs some interesting and new ideas.
So in your book, you give examples like the Lamingtons in the UK. Can you talk about that and tell everyone about that one? Because I just loved that story.
Yeah, right. Radio Lamington was an initiative set up by actually an Australian entrepreneur who went over to the UK and established a whole series of really innovative and interesting cafes and restaurants in the UK. They started with one food van and they now have about 11 fantastic premises in across London. I think they were voted by TripAdvisor, one of the world's best brunch spots, or one of their places. And of course, during the pandemic, everything stopped in London. But Prue Freeman, the CEO, she didn't want to just stop doing things. She wanted to look around and figure out how can she keep some of her staff engaged and also how can she help people. And she was missing a taste of home. So loves Lamingtons as a taste of home, coming from Australia. And she also realised that some extraordinary proportion of the UK ambulance service and health service, in fact, were made up of Australians and New Zealanders. So she got together some of her team and thought, we're going to bake these extraordinary lamingtons. They came up with beautiful flavors. They baked these boxes of lamingtons and they started giving them away for free. And then they started also running a project where for every box of lamingtons someone bought, they would donate a full box to the NHS, the National Health Service over there. They have given away thousands upon thousands of lamingtons throughout the course of the pandemic. And, it's just such a fantastic example of someone who was in the middle of a crisis, but still wanted to do something constructively, despite the fact that they couldn't operate all their venues, and wanted to make a difference. So there was a brilliant creative idea. They delivered it fantastically, and so many people benefited and shared the love.
I just love that story. Thank you for sharing that. Um, so say someone like Prue, say if there was someone in her business or someone she had to answer to that was like, that's a ridiculous idea. What are you thinking? How can you help listeners overcome that, or just create some sort of swerve so that their whoever they report to or answer to is easily persuaded by their idea?
So I think there's a couple of things to unpick there because on the one hand, not all ideas are a fantastic idea and most ideas need to be further developed. So the starting point is you've got to make sure that everyone in your organization understands that coming up with new ideas and testing and exploring new ideas is a good thing, is that we want to allocate and devote time and energy to exploring ideas and seeing what comes out of them. Sometimes I talk about the fact that everybody's waiting for the lightning to strike. that brilliant idea that's like huge and amazing and everybody's going to jump on board. But often innovation actually starts more like those first few drops of rain on a summer day. So it's just like one little drop, one small idea, but then someone else contributes another little drop, another small idea. And before you know it, the ideas are building upon each other to create something really special. So the first thing is just to be open to the small ideas and test them out and explore them in a bit more depth, because then other people come on board to agree with them. The second thing I'd say is that the clearer an organisation is about its shared ambition. So what is the core purpose of the organisation and where are you trying to achieve, where are you trying to get to over the long term? If everyone is clear about that, then it gives you more space to explore those great ideas that come up, because you can see those interesting ideas in the context of what your bigger picture is. And that helps everybody have a more constructive conversation, because you're not just going to say, no, that's not in the budget this year. You can talk about it, say, well, how does that fit within our bigger picture? Is it important? Is it going to be a contributor to where we're ultimately trying to go? And sometimes that really helps people at all levels to be more open to testing the waters on
And
things as well.
is that what you mean when you refer to the shared story?
Absolutely. I do love that concept of a shared story, because I think unless we genuinely understand where our organisation is trying to get to and we support it and believe in it, things don't
Not going to
happen.
happen.
Yeah.
No.
I mean, how many times have you seen people walk out of meetings go, oh, yeah, it's 10 to 5, we've got to agree on everything now. So they kind of, yep, let's move on. But they don't really understand what it was they've agreed to, and they're not really genuinely committed to bringing it to life when you leave the meeting.
Exactly. And I did find when I was reading your book, asking myself in the different businesses that I've worked in, well, not asking myself, but realizing how hard as a business leader it is to make this shift. Like you really have to be passionate and determined and persevere, because you're going to get pushed back a lot by, sadly, I think there's a lot of people that are like, well, we've always done it this way. Why do we need to change it? Do you know what I mean? And with that, Rosie, I wanted to ask you, because you've been involved with a lot of different businesses, board directors and strategists and CEOs. Can you tell us about someone, and you don't have to say their name if you're not comfortable, but somebody that you really admire who did actually embrace this concept of creativity and shared story and purpose, and that you had an impact on and helped them implement that throughout their business?
Look, I've worked with some wonderful, I thought you were going to ask me for a nightmare story just then. I'm like, oh,
Tempting, but I don't
not
think
going
it's
to
really
share any stories
helpful.
there. I have worked with some amazing organisations who really make a difference. One that I have done some work with over the last few years is Tourism Australia. And I've been just fascinated to watch how they, all of us have had challenges, but, I was doing a global leadership retreat with them back in, I think it was November 2019. Just when their head of marketing, chief marketing officer was, previewing their big new campaign that was going out in the UK. And, there was all this excitement around it. It was a fantastic campaign with Kylie Minogue and a host of others. And of course, what happened, just after that campaign launched to enormous success, we had the bushfires and then we had the pandemic, and Tourism Australia's plans obviously had to all be put on hiatus and they had to think very differently. Now, I can't take the credit for all that they've done since then. I wasn't involved with that creative, but I loved having worked with them on and off over the last 2 years, seeing the way they absolutely held to their core purpose of making sure that Australia was top of mind and that people want generating that desire to travel over the long term. They kept focusing on that while also adapting in the short term. And all of a sudden, for the first time, running domestic campaigns when people were allowed to travel, to bring them to various states where they were able to travel to. So I think they really mastered that art of both holding on to that long-term vision and also changing things in the now to make the most of what they had to work with. And of course, they're known for their creative. I love watching TA's creative, and they maintain that creative approach and that, I think, real prime commitment to building great creative as part of their campaign.
How would you advise a leader on when to know if it's working or not, and what to do if implementing a new strategy is not working? Like, how do you shift direction, or do you know what I mean?
Absolutely. I suppose the first thing is if you're clear about what your long-term objective is, what your shared ambition is, then you can also set some milestones along the way of how you expect to meet them. I think we have to accept the fact that strategy is never going to be fully fixed because, even before COVID, we live in a really uncertain world. Things happen, competitors turn up, government rules change, all sorts of things are different. So we are constantly changing and adapting. So I don't think we need to be afraid of changing the strategy. Where I do think people stumble a little bit is if they're not clear about that longer term picture, that longer term broad shared ambition, you're more likely to get distracted and zigzag all over the way. Whereas if at least you have that guiding light sort of further up ahead, you're more likely to be able to see different paths to still get to where you need to go. So I think that would be my first piece of advice. Just be really clear about what your long game is, and then be open to adapting what you're doing in the moment to keep moving forward towards that.
Such good advice. And then I think one of the other things you talk about, which I want you to elaborate on, is how not to wait, what am I saying? How to prioritize creating this strategy, because we all get so bogged down with targets and daily tasks and meetings and daily commitments that the big long game big picture strategy often just keeps getting put off. So
Mhm.
how does a business avoid doing that? And also how can they make it even more effective than just, oh, we're having a yearly strategy meeting and let's all just gather and wait for morning tea. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah. So I
A
would
little bit
say
negative, but
Yeah, but it's true. That's the way, sometimes people have this, it's April or it's September, so we're having our annual strategy session this month. So roll out check the agenda from last time and roll it out and do it again. I think I would always say that, first of all, strategy does have to be an investment, and I think as organizations, we actually need to invest more in and expect more out of our strategy conversations. So actually raising the expectations about what this session is going to be and what this process is going to be. I think when we just consider it's a 1 day or it's a 2 day offsite, that's not really enough. Like, you have to look at it as a process. You need to work through that process of making sure before the session you've thought through what are the strategic issues we need to consider. How are we, have we got all the information together in advance so that rather than, churning through lots of decks and, data, we can actually talk more about what this information all means and what can we do with this information to transform our future. So I think considering it a process is part of it, and also putting in play some key elements for the session so that it isn't just another meeting, so that you have thought about how are you going to inspire some different perspectives, how are you bringing some different perspectives into the room, how are you going to allow people the time and space to have creative thoughts, and test different ideas. How are you going to make sure that by the end of the session you're really clear about what matters most? So what are the most important decisions that you've made during the session? And I think the other thing which really helps organisations is not to consider strategy completely separate from all your other meetings. So if you're doing a work in progress or you're doing a monthly catch up on where you're up to, make sure you revisit the milestones you set as part of your strategy then and say, in our strategy, these were the 3 things we considered were the most important things to get done. How are we progressing on those? Start your ongoing conversations with that focus on what's most important. And that can help bring the strategy to life every day in the way you run your organization.
exactly. And also keep that concept of the shared story going, which I really think is powerful. Um,
Absolutely.
so my last question is, And this person can come from anywhere in your life. Who do you admire most as a leader?
So I'm actually going to step back a little bit to one of the first organizations I worked with I was working as a lobbyist at the time, and I was doing quite a bit of work with Network 10. And at the time, a Canadian CEO had been brought in to run Network 10 and bring it out of receivership. Peter Viner was his name. And I felt really privileged to be in a lot of the executive meetings that he ran when we were talking about regulation and government relations and those sorts of issues. And I always just found it fascinating that he was the first leader I saw who would sit in a room, request information and ideas from everyone sitting around the table, and only speak after he'd heard from everybody else's views. And he was really good at synchronizing the views around the table, understanding, sort of bringing out from those discussions what the key issues were, and helping the group come together to actually land on a shared story and land on that shared agreement so that everybody was clear about what had been decided and what had to happen next. So I found that really interesting at an early stage of my career, to see someone who was so on top of his game, knew all the information, but was still extremely collegiate in the way he ran those meetings. So I think collegiate and confident at the same time is an interesting blend, and not all leaders are comfortable to run both of those attributes at the same time.
Oh, you're so lucky to have worked with him.
Yeah.
That's the and I understand what you mean by collegiate. It's like they could just they obviously have vast knowledge, and they could just come in and tell everyone what they know and give them orders and directions, and everyone, off you go, report back to me in 90 days. But instead, it's, genuinely being interested in what people have to say and what they're thinking, and that's how you grow. That's how you build businesses or any organizations, families, or um, any business.
It's true. And it brings so much more power into the room for all those people in the room. That was a really valuable early leadership experience for me.
Thank you for sharing that. Okay, I've got one last question. Have you got another book in you, or are you just basking in the glory of this one?
I'm actually loving having the opportunity to talk with people about this book, because it does, offer those two perspectives. One, how do you lead an organization through a strategic planning process, but also how do each of us individually actually become more strategic in the way we plan our own lives, or plan our own, plan the way we work as well. So I feel like I've got a lot to talk about on this book, but I have to say, one of the things I loved about writing the book was the opportunity to interview some other leaders who I've worked with, and leaders who I really respect for what they've achieved and how they run strategy. So I can absolutely, I would love to do some more work in the future, working with more leaders in the field, and, coming up with those shared experiences and suggestions that are going to help all of us create more powerful strategy.
So exciting. I do, when I was reading it, I was also thinking the same thing. I was like, this could help me in my personal life. It's just they blend together.
It's true.
So I can't emphasize enough how much I enjoyed it, and I hope that I can um, share your story with a lot more people, and get you more people to talk to, because it's really great advice. I thoroughly enjoyed it, and thank you for talking to me today.
Oh, thanks so much, Carol. It's been a pleasure.